Nick, can we start with the kind of context of into which Turner and the Commission was established? You know, what the welfare state on pensions looked like at that point, and why reforms were needed.
Okay. Well, where do you want to start? Well, not bad place to start actually is the 1950s, because you had the basic state pension that Beveridge set up, and there was a growing pressure for second pensions, private second pensions. And interestingly, this was a movement which the unions were fully behind. They talked about deferred pay, so private pension was deferred pay for your old age. And so there was this huge drive that built up private second pension schemes. And they never covered more than 40% of the working population, but they were a huge growth and advance. And that left the question about what you did for the people who didn't have companies big enough to provide a second pension. So you get the build-up for the argument for a second state pension, which became the state earnings-related pension in 1974. To cut a long history short, if you see what I mean. So that got set up, was waved through the House of Commons by Norman Fowler, with the Conservatives not voting against, because there'd been 15, 20 years of trying to get a second state pension set up, degree of exhaustion. So it just went through. And the forecasts for its future costs weren't very robust at the time. And within 2 or 3 years, everyone was back cutting it away. So you had this big, very generous second state pension set up, STIRPs, which then had to be cut back. And the story over the 80s and 90s was the Conservatives progressively cutting it back. And we still got a lot of poor pensioners who are on supplementary benefit. And you sort of arrive at the Labour government arriving, so we have this second state pension that's been cut back quite a lot. You've got the basic state pension, which has been linked to prices only since 1981. So in real terms, its value is progressively declining, and you've still got a hell of a lot of poor pensioners. So Labour's first response was to boost the means-tested income for poorer pensioners through a series of steps which ended up with pension credit, which was quite generous and was, although it was never legislated, it was in policy terms linked to earnings. So you're in this position where the means-tested pension for the poorest is growing by earnings, and the basic state pension for everybody else is going up only by prices, and the one overtakes the other. The means-tested one overtakes the value of the, which is always predictable, but it starts giving you a problem, because it's not then clear that if you have the basic state pension and you save for your old age privately through whatever scheme, if you're not very well, if it's not obvious, you'll be better off from doing that, particularly if this situation persists for 2 or 3 decades. So the incentives to save privately were falling away. And that was recognised as a problem. There was another related but wider argument going on within the Labour government in its early days about the future of universalism in the social security system, where the sort of Brown argument was we can't afford to do everything for everybody, we need to concentrate resources on the neediest most, and therefore we build up means-tested benefits at the expense of universal ones. And there was, you may remember, the massive sort of row with Frank Field, who was appointed to think the unthinkable about welfare reform, and basically proposed a compulsory universal private sector solution to this, which would have cost a lot of money, and Frank lost, Brown won, and that course was sort of set. So that's the sort of state position. And the Labour government did think quite hard about it. I mean, it set up something called the Pension Provision Group, which was a bunch of brainy pension experts which advised them. And when the pension credit was set up and running, they pointed out that this was a great policy for today to help the poorest pensioners, but in the long run it was unsustainable for the reasons I set out. It would just undermine private saving. This was a very unwelcome message, and they basically got disbanded. So that's the state position. Then we're back to private pensions. So these private pensions that employers set up in the 50s and 60s had grown enormously. Over the years, when they originally set up, they were typically flat rate. You got a flat rate for a year of service. Typically only men got them. Early leavers got nothing back. And over the years, for a series of scandals and perceived injustices, these got built up. So first of all, women got access to them, then there were widows' benefits, and they had to be indexed, both the contributions as they were going in and then the payments as they came out. Widowers then got benefits. And there were a whole bunch of other changes after Maxwell raided the mirror pension funds to try and save his business. And so what started out in the 1950s as schemes that might be costing employers perhaps 10, 12% of pay, by the late 1990s were costing them 20, 26% of pay. They become really expensive. And what then happened was three things that are absolutely clear in the rear-view mirror, but were not at all clear at the time happened. The first was that there was the stock market boom in the 80s and 90s. And almost all the money in these, what were now called defined benefit pension schemes, because they paid you out a defined benefit proportion of your salary at the end of your working life, were invested in equities. And the markets were doing really well, so the pension funds appeared to be an enormous surplus. But in fact, they were costing more. But they appeared to be in surplus, and that sort of hid that problem. The Treasury misread it because they saw these surpluses as being far more than was needed, so they started taxing surpluses. So that employers started taking contribution holidays. They stopped paying in. And then the 1990s, late 1990s, 2000, end of the dot-com boom, there was a delayering of middle management in a lot of companies. And that was paid for not by the employer directly, but by using the pension fund money to give people early retirements. And just to compound all that, the actuaries weren't getting it right. The actuaries had what sounds like a perfectly reasonable assumption, which may yet come to be true, that there's what's called the limit to life hypothesis, that life expectancy was rising, but it couldn't go on rising forever. At some point they had to come to a halt. So their models were built around a limit to life hypothesis, and people kept living longer than the models predicted. So every few years there had to be a big upward revision in life expectancy and therefore in the cost of these schemes. And so what happened was suddenly a stampede of closures of defined benefit schemes. Now, they'd never covered more than 40% of and there'd been a slow decline from the 80s, one or two because of cost, mainly because a lot of the newer service companies, the Amazons, your Googles and your what have you, never set up those sorts of schemes in the first place. So there was declining coverage for this. You then had these three problems being compounded, and on top of that, there was an accounting rule change. So that in the past, schemes accounted for their future liabilities kind of any way they liked, and a rule called FRS 17 came in, which basically said on a given day you had to mark to market. You had to look at what the equities were worth and what your liabilities were, and the scheme was then either in deficit or surplus. Now, that may not seem a very sensible way of trying to measure what is a decades-long contract for an individual if they go in their 20s and don't die till they're 19, is for a mature scheme runs into 100 years with successive waves of, but you had to mark to market. So if the market crashed, suddenly the schemes looked they were in massive deficit. If the market was doing particularly well, they looked as they were in massive surplus, when probably neither was actually true. And the dot-com boom crashed and the market went through the floor. So you've got all these pressures about misjudging life expectancy, all of it's in equities, they're getting more expensive. Dot-com boom crashes it, and the FRS 17 says you're mark to market. There are black holes everywhere. And so very, very fast, schemes started closing, first of all to new members, and then quite rapidly to further contributions from existing members. And the speed of that was phenomenal. I mean, something like 50% of schemes from household names, Sainsbury's, ICI, Tesco, BT, closed in the space of about 3 or 4 years. So you've got this state problem, which is that the minimum income guarantee is, the pension credit is rising faster than the basic state pension, and incentives to save privately are being gradually whittled away, and you've got a collapse in defined benefit salary pension schemes. And when companies replace these schemes, they replace them with money purchase or defined contribution schemes, into which typically they were putting sort of 6 to 10% of pay as against the 26% it was. So what private sector provision you have that looks likely to be left is a lot less generous. So you have a crisis. And at this point, Tony Blair gets seriously engaged. Now, what to do about the defined benefit schemes? So government fretted about this and it commissioned a number of reports. The biggest one of which saw the light of day was Alan Pickering's report, which basically said, you know, that the industry was saying, well, can you cut some of this red tape? Can we reduce indexation? Can we do something about survivors' benefits? Can we make some of this more voluntary? Can we cut some of the red tape, cut some of the obligations? And if you do that, we might be able to keep more of these things open. And Pickering basically said you can do a bunch of those things, and that was commissioned by Alistair Darling, but it landed just after Andrew Smith had become Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, who deemed many of these proposals not very attractive. And Pickering actually made a slight cock-up on the day of selling it, and the thing just sort of died. And there were other government reports commissioned, one or two of which actually never saw the light of day, aimed at trying to make the cost of defined salary pension schemes lower. That never happened. And if you were sitting where I was sitting at the time on the FT, we went through an awful lot of pensions ministers. I mean, not Secretaries of State, but we had 11 pension ministers in 13 years. And we had quite a run of Secretaries of State through various accidents. And where we were sitting, it looked like ministers were a bit trapped in the headlights, frankly, because there were these proposals to cut the cost of final salary schemes to try and save them. But A, ministers weren't convinced that if they did that, it would necessarily stem the closures. B, if they did legislate to do that and the closures didn't stop, they'd be blamed for they'd be blamed for the schemes failing. It would have been a horrible bill to get through Parliament, because it would have been all sorts of tiny technical changes to rules for pension schemes to allow them to do this, and so it just didn't happen. The schemes just carried on closing. So that sort of gets you to the sort of background of where the Turner Commission came from.
And so Turner starts as a commission that's designed primarily to address the issue on the private side.
That's what it started as, yes.
And yet the terms of reference are such that...
Well, there was a big row about setting it up in the first place. Because, Gordon considered pensions his bailiwick, certainly the state bit, because he's Chancellor of the Exchequer, but also kind of in many ways the rest. And there was a huge debate going on within government about whether the answer to this was compulsory pension saving. If this is all stopping happening, maybe we should have a compulsory scheme. People were looking at Australia, which had a very successful compulsory scheme. We're looking at the States and 401ks around the world. Should we have compulsion? Singapore has compulsion. And that debate raged back and forth sort of between, I suppose, about 2000 to 2003, 4, when, 2002 when the Pension Commission got set up. And there were differing views, genuinely differing views within government. I think what swung it in the end was Blair was in favour of individuals being compelled to save, but was less in favour of employers being compelled to contribute, because he was worried about the effect that might have on jobs. And I think what persuaded him in the end was that if you had compulsory pension saving for all, for the people at the very bottom, they wouldn't be able to save a great deal, and they probably wouldn't in the end be able to save enough to get them off means-tested benefits, particularly if means-tested benefits are a growing proportion. So so Blair wants an inquiry. There's stories knocking around the papers about whether there was going to be a Royal Commission or not, and the ministers denying there was going to be a Royal Commission. And so Turner got set up, and there were rows about his terms of reference. There were basically rows between Number 10 and the Treasury, and with DWP sort of trying to hold the ring in the middle of all this, about what the remit would be, who would be on it. There's a little bit of back history, which you may or may not be interested in, but remember the Wanless report on health spending? Brown had originally invited Adair Turner to do that. But as you will know, well, Nick, Brown had a tendency to commission reports where he knew what the answer he wanted was. They were known as the Treasury's his master's voice reports. And he made clear to Adair that it was only going to be about the quantum of spending on the NHS. It was not about how the money was raised. And Adair said he wasn't going to do that. He wanted to look at the way the money was raised. I think he would have come down in favour of what was there, but he wasn't prepared to. So he didn't do that, and then had done a little bit of work on NHS management for Blair. So Gordon saw Adair as Tony's man slightly, which didn't help in the long run. So there's a rouse about setting it up, and it gets announced in a green paper in 2002 by Andrew Smith. And the debate was such that the terms of reference got inserted at the very last minute at the printers, and if you read them, they are incredibly badly phrased, which just tells you there was a row about them. And it's not even presented as a proper inquiry. It's a sort of standing commission to review whether the voluntary saving system is working or whether compulsion might be necessary, and that's kind of all it is. And I doubt you'll talk to Adair, but there was a background about that. In the end, he felt he had to sort of settle for what he could get by way of terms of reference, and he got two very good people to work with him in John Hills and Jeannie Drake. So it's a very cleverly constructed triumvirate.
So just on that point, because the model, from the sort of 50s onwards had been to create royal commissions. There had been actually a royal commission on social care that Blair had established. In this instance, a different model is proposed.
Yeah.
Why do you was that Adair's idea? Was it Number 10's idea? What was the kind of reasoning behind that?
Yes, I don't know exactly. I mean, royal commissions had fallen out of favour. I mean, Harold Wilson's famous quip, "They take minutes of last year's," and the Royal Commission on long-term care had not been a success, certainly from the English point of view. The Scots adopted it, but the English didn't. They take a long time. They tend to be, there's a tendency for them to be consensual, where occasionally what you want is a slightly bolder solution. And they've just fallen out of favour. I mean, there hardly have been any since the one on long-term care. And the one in the House of Lords, that went nowhere. They just fell out of favour. So it was a different sort of inquiry. I've talked rather disparagingly about Gordon and his Master's Voice reports, but there had been a number of very smaller, much smaller inquiries that had actually looked quite effective. So you end up with that sort of model. So off they go, and they start work, and Adair and Jeannie and John have their regular dinners. And I must admit, when that green paper was published, and this was a standing commission to look at it just looked like the whole thing had been kicked into the long grass, just to disappear forever. And then a few months in, Adair gives this interview. I mean, luckily enough for me, but I went down to talk to him and I said, "So, what are you going to do?" And it's an open question. He didn't stop talking for 40 minutes. I mean, we're going to do this, and this. We're going to look at that, and that, and that. I got to the end of that. I said, "But you've just rewritten your terms of reference." And he says, "Well, you can't just look at the private sector without looking at its interaction with the state, I'm afraid. So we're going to do that." So off they go and do that, and they produce the first report, which was a kind of masterpiece, really, because it went through all the numbers, it set out the arguments, it was an indisputable, factual thing. And it said, if we're not going to have poorer pensioners in future, then one of three things have to happen. People have to save more, they have to work longer, they have to pay higher taxes. One of these three has to happen, and possibly a combination of these three. And then a great bit of showmanship shortly afterwards. Adair said, "Well, anyone who claims to have a solution to the pension problem and can't tell you how much of each of these is involved is a charlatan." And it kind of just laid the ground. It made the argument. It talked about raising the state pension age. It talked about saving more, it talked about working. So it just sort of set the stall. And I think that was a brilliant piece of small p politics.
So that's a combination of analysis, very, very high quality analysis.
Yeah, high quality analysis.
Which required officials, required others with capabilities that could be brought to bear, modelling trajectories, costs and so on.
Yeah, and someone like Adair, who actually is one of these people who just can go back to first principles. What is a pension for? What are we trying to do here? Just where are we? How can we move?
So, clarity of analysis.
Yeah, John Hills, Jeannie Drake, these are clever people.
The other issue, of course, and again in your role as a journalist here rather than as an historian, there was a much more kind of ongoing public airing of the views of the Commission.
Yeah.
Would you say that was important?
Yeah, it was very important. I mean, Adair sort of toured the country talking to people, and not leaking what he's going to do, just setting out the arguments. And there's another bit of the background that's worth recording, because in an attempt to do something about private pensions, Labour had introduced something called the stakeholder pension, which was on paper quite a nice little looking product where employers had to nominate a provider, and the idea was that people would pay in, but neither the employee had to pay in nor did the employer, and most of these things are as empty boxes. 80% of them had no one contributing, neither the employer nor the employee. So there'd been that attempt to have a go at the private sector thing, and that had failed. They insisted on quite low charges for those days of 1%. us a charge. And of course the industry came back and said, well, no one's buying them. If you let us charge 1.5%, then we can market them properly. But as you know as well as I did, Nick, 1.5% eats up a vast amount of the savings pot over 30 or 40 years. I mean, half of it. And so all that was kind of, going nowhere. So Adair sets out his stall. And one of the points he makes is that there were 10 million people making no pension saving, 10 million employed people making no pension saving whatsoever. And the industry, despite saying it was interested, was clearly failing to address that market at all, frankly, because it couldn't make money out of it. Because the thing about a collective, a workplace pension is because the administration is all tied in together, because you can pool all the risks, you pool all the costs, you can take in low-paid people and they will see something from it. When you have an individualised product, it just doesn't work. And Adair spotted that and spelt that out and made that plain as part of the report, which is where the National Pension Savings Scheme bit of the report came from.
So let's start with that then. So the first element of that is to not do the Frank Field option of compulsion, but to go with the behavioural economics that says auto-enrolment will get you to 90%. Let's dwell on that then, because it's probably the first...
It's the first big application of behavioural economics, I think.
And it predates the sort of popularisation of nudge and all those things. This is done before all that. Where do you think those ideas come into British public policy from?
It's the 401ks in the US, and it's the KiwiSaver in New Zealand, which was basically a sort of opt-in, you're in, you can opt out approach. And there was tolerably good evidence that worked pretty well. Actually, I was a bit questioning. There was reasonably robust evidence that worked. And the DWP published a paper in the middle of Turner's first, before the first report, setting out that experience, and clearly the Pensions Commission latched onto it and thought there might be a solution here, because in a sense it squares the circle, doesn't it? It sidesteps the compulsion issue. It gets you out of that argument. I talked earlier about some of the reasons why Blair had resistance to compulsion. The other worry was that even though it was for pension saving, I think it was a part of Gordon's worry, that the Tories would present it as a tax. You're compelled to save this is a tax. And flogging tax to the British public, as you know, is never an easy option. So there was that worry, whereas if you can opt out, well, it's not a tax, is it?
And the industry comes to accept these proposals because it sees it doesn't disturb its sort of middle and higher income earners market. DC schemes, and this is bringing people in who otherwise would remain out. And
no, the industry doesn't come to accept this. I mean, one of the interesting bits is when the first report was published. There was a someone's got to say this, which is we're going to have to work longer. State pension ages are going to have to rise. That's what the demographics tell us. All the serious politicians in all the main political parties knew this, but none of them felt able to say it. And so when the Pensions Commission said it, there was this sort of huge collective sigh of relief. And so at the end of day one, kind of almost everyone is saying, yeah, this looks all right, except the insurance side of the pensions industry, which did not want a national pension savings scheme, what became Nest. And it fought on and was saying, we can do this, in the teeth of all the evidence. So it didn't accept it overnight. It was quite a long battle. And it's to the credit of John Hutton and James Purnell and others, they stood firm about that.
Yes.
So the insurance side of the industry didn't welcome that with open arms at all.
And that opposition was not mobilised in Parliament then. So the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats come behind. I mean, they basically say, we will back this commission.
Yes, well, Willits was the pension spokesman at the time the first report came out. And Willits is a sensible guy. And Turner had said things that needed to be said. So that bit was all good, Wrinkle we might get onto, Steve Webb favoured all the state stuff, was a bit more reserved about the National Pension Savings Scheme, wasn't quite sure about that for the Lib Dems,
so,
as became clear when he got into office.
In the middle of all of that, of course, there's a financial crisis, 2008, and yet this framework seems to endure. And does so with a new government that is committed to cutting very extensively public expenditure. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, partly because we got Steve Webb as a pensions minister who understood pensions. You know, it's unusual to have a minister who actually understands it, but he did understand, had a good background in them. He'd always believed in rebuilding the basic state pension, and he had a long-term ambition to get to a single state pension. You know, get rid of this two-tier state one, get rid of what was by now second state pension. He was a bit more sceptical about Nest as it became. He commissioned a report from Paul Johnson, which basically looked at it and said, you know, in biblical terms, this is good. You can make a few tweaks here, but it's good. And so he bought it. And they were lucky in who they hired to set Nest up. They got good people to do it. And it sort of hung on in there. And it may have survived the financial crisis and all that because, A, it was quite long term, B, it came in at a very low level, so the immediate impact on people's incomes was very small. And you know, a consensus had been built around this. And you know, to be fair to George Osborne as Chancellor, he could see the merit in this as well. So it's one of those relatively rare examples in British public life where you get, you know, you get something that is proposed under a Labour government, supported by a Tory opposition, led in government by a Liberal Democrat minister and supported by a Tory Chancellor. It's a genuine cross-party effort to get to a solution that made sense. And it also survived, I think, because it makes sense. It is a sensible answer to what was a transparently large problem.
So let's go back to the other two key parts of the Turner Commission report then. So increases in the basic state pension age, re-indexing to earnings, and at that stage still retaining, but at flat rate, a second state pension, which obviously then Webb reforms when he comes in. The big argument then is with the Treasury about the affordability of the re-indexing to earnings of the basic state pension.
Yes, this is at the time of the second report when it comes out, when there was a mega blazing row with Gordon. I mean, he had Adair in and told him he couldn't do this. It was the Chancellor's prerogative. He was talking about state pensions. Nice cop, nasty cop approach. You know, if you don't change your things, there'll probably never be a serious public appointment for you in your life again. And to be fair, you know, Adair and John Hills and Jeannie just stood firm and said, no, this is the right thing to do. There is a lovely story that about 3 days out from publication, Adair's at home and he gets a call from Jonathan Powell, Blair's chief of staff, who's at a heads of government meeting in Malta, and says, look, Tony can't get out at dinner because it's a dinner, but he just wants to let you know that he hopes you'll stand up to Gordon, and if you do, he'll stand by you publicly. You know, so the rows reached that stage, as Adair says. You know, you realise how just dysfunctional this all was. Brown was briefing that Adair had got his sums wrong, and I mean, it's just a bit that happened to involve me, but you know those 1950 films, spy films, where they meet in St James's Park and they sit on benches and brown paper envelopes are passed across in the mist? Well, I got a phone call saying, can you meet in Embankment Gardens in 20 minutes? And so I said yes. So I walked into Embankment Gardens, there's someone sitting on a bench, and I said, sit next to them. He literally hands over a brown paper envelope with one sheet of paper in it, which is figure 3 from the second report. He says, you will understand this, just go away and write it. And it's the chart that shows that the Pension Commission has got its sums right and has taken into account all the things that Gordon was briefing he hadn't, which of course produced its own mega row with all sorts of people being accused of leaking it, including I think Matthew Taylor, who threatened to sue if someone didn't withdraw the allegation. But in a funny way, kind of all that helped when the report finally came out, because again it was sort of trailing what was coming, so that when it landed there was no great surprise in what it recommended. The ground had been very well tilled beforehand. I mean, Turner originally recommended the link should be restored to earnings in 2010, and that was resisted, and I think it was John Hutton who drafted a compromise which said by 2012 or the end of the next Parliament, which kind of stuck, so to speak, and it in fact happened earlier because the coalition did it. I mean, talking of one of the handicaps around the original terms of reference was that what the Pension Commission didn't do was sort out the two-tier state pension, And I think that's partly because although Dairy wrote his terms of reference, there was kind of a limit to how far he could go. So had that not been there, we might have got to where Webb got to a bit earlier. But with the internal Labour Party politics just made that impossible at the time.
And I suppose, one of the critiques of the Commission is that even with a flat rate pension, single tier flat rate pension, the whole effort, as it were, to create a second state pension system that would link to earnings would make us look more continental than Beveridgean. That had kind of finally been laid to rest, in a sense. That was given up as an ambition.
Yes. There was a period in the 60s and 70s when we had some other earnings related benefits as well, where we were sort of moving away from the flat rate Beveridgean subsistence model of what a social security side of the welfare state should look like, towards a more continental earnings related one, but none of that lasted in the end. The earnings related elements for unemployment benefit disappeared very quickly. We were moving more towards a European model, earnings related model, but the unemployment bits of that disappeared very quickly, and SERPs, it took longer, but basically got built up and then knocked down again. And of course the other thing the Turner Commission didn't do was, although it was set up because of the crisis in defined benefit pension schemes, it actually didn't do anything about them at all. It's almost unnoticed, but it didn't try and rescue them. It kind of let them run their course.
It takes it as inevitable that decline.
And I think I've never discussed this with Adair, but I think he just took the view that they were just too expensive and they weren't going to last, and we couldn't do much about it. There's a bit of an irony that the big crisis, or a large part of the crisis that led to it being set up, it didn't in fact address. But a little like auto-enrolment being an answer to compulsion, Nest is an answer to what do you do if final salary schemes are going to go. And of course they still exist in the public sector.
Yeah. And there are, I suppose, two things that happened in the post-2010 period that relate to that point. One is the attempt to develop collective DC schemes, and the first of those Royal Mail coming on. And then the second is Osborne's pension freedoms. And some would argue actually threaten the Turner consensus. Would you agree with that? Do you think this potentially at least can kind of unstitch all of this?
I think, I'm not sure it will unstitch it all. It certainly risks undermining it. The big thing, in a sense, you have to grasp about the defined benefit closures is that if you're in a defined benefit scheme, basically the employer took all the risk, right? They took the risk on how long you'd live, they took the risk of the investment as the pension fund was being built up, and they took the inflation risk, or a large part of the inflation risk, once the benefits were in payment. And individual DC schemes, money purchase schemes, transfer all that risk to the individual. The individual's just not well placed to take those risks, so you want to pool it, which is why there's been some interest in collective DC schemes, because you start to pool some of those risks back in. But then you get to pension freedom at drawdown. Well, it's sort of understandable that, because post-financial crash annuity rates are a bit dreadful, A, because life expectancy keeps rising, so they cost more, and B, because interest rates have been so low. So the return from annuities was very low and not attractive. And you can understand why there was a lot of agitation, including from Steve Webb, to do something about it. But George Osborne went all the way. And what will happen? Well, we can already see there is some mis-selling. People are being persuaded to take their money out of DB schemes and put them into inferior DC schemes where they get charged a lot of money and lose. That's definitely going on. So that's a sort of mis-selling scandal in practice. There's a risk that if people do that, they'll spend down too fast because people tend to underestimate their life expectancy. Now, that's a political view. How paternalistic do you think the state should be? There's a political argument there. People will have different views. Some of there's equally the risk that people will take their money out and have a large pot of money, but know it's the only pot of money they've got and not spend enough because they're hoarding it. All these things will happen, but there will certainly be some mis-selling. How far it undermines the whole settlement, I'm not sure. this hasn't happened yet, but I do think one thing it does call into question is tax relief for pension saving. Because if you're basically going to say, this is an ISA, you can save the money, it's tax-free as you go through, and you can draw it down subject to being taxed on it. Why do you give all this tax relief up front to pay for it? It costs $30 billion a year. I think the thing it really calls into question in the long run is tax relief on private pension saving. But if you took tax relief on private pension saving away, what would happen? Well, the answer is we don't know, but people might not save because there's a big tax advantage in saving for a pension. But you're spending $30 billion on it, but you're letting people treat it as though it's just another form of savings. So I think that's the bit it potentially really calls into question rather than necessarily undermines. And there is a risk that if too much of this goes on, it might start undermining auto enrolment and all that. I think that's a lower risk because it's a longer term risk.
Let's just, if we can, talk a bit more about the sort of politics of this. So one argument here is that these reforms have proved possible precisely because they don't confront really in a serious way the power of employers.
Well, I think there's some validity in that criticism. Two things to say. Some employers are putting more in, particularly those which already had sort of other DC schemes. So there's a proportion of employers who are putting more in. And secondly, I don't think it was ever the intention that this was going to be 8% full stop. If you look at the experience of Australia, for example, with its compulsory pension contributions, it started off small and built up. Now, Australia's a very different country. It's got very powerful unions. It can do that sort of deal, which you can't do here. But there's a clear implicit intention that you start off small, you get it up and running, gets accepted, and a future government can start to ratchet it up a bit more. And that's a sort of very Fabian gradualist approach to trying to get reform. But if you'd come in and said everyone's going to put 10% in from day one, I just don't think it would ever got off the ground. It's a judgment about what is politically possible to achieve at any given moment. The worst thing in a sense is it would have taken 12 years from the Turner report to get auto enrolment fully up and running, and then only at 8%. It's been painfully slow. But, so far, and I speak just before there's about to be a hike in the rates, but so far the opt-out rates have been very low, much lower than people expected. It looks like one of the bigger public policy successes of the last couple of decades.
And going back into the history of this then, so, seen across the sweep of that history from the 50s, where we are now does look like it is very kind of consistent with the history of the evolution of the British welfare state. You are the historian of the British welfare state. How is it that you think that we come to that point?
Some of the driver is demography, because if you have a very, very generous second state pension or very, very, very generous state pension and the population is ageing and growing at the rate it has been, that does get very expensive. And that is competing against resources for health and education and every other part of the public realm. So there's probably a question that politicians don't think about that consciously, but they must do unconsciously, which is just how much of the cake can this take? And you get back into the old, the standard political argument about what is the state's responsibility, what is the individual responsibility here, and maybe we need to devise something where the state, basically very British Beveridgean approach, we will give you a basic platform, but you need to do more on top. And we've now given them a basic platform of when it finally gets there, a single state pension, which will be worth around a quarter of average earnings, which is what it was at its peak in the 1980s. So you've got the platform, but we kind of guarantee that. And so anything you do save, you will see the benefits of saving on top, even if it's not a lot. And we've given you a vehicle that helps you do that. So that's a very British solution, isn't it? If you view it in the long run of history, you could almost say we went down a sort of 35, 40-year diversion into other things and come back to where we started. Not literally where we started, but conceptually where we started. But I think that's driven in part by demography, because of the competition from other parts of the public realm for public resources.
Some would say, though, that since the financial crisis, the bits of the public realm that have remained protected are those that serve older people, pensioners, their entitlements, the NHS. The bits that have been cut are those that serve the working age population. And actually the balance has been struck between the generations rather than between the individual and the state.
You can look at it that way. I mean, there are bits of the current dispensation will have to go. The triple lock will eventually have to go. You can't keep that forever, because it does mean that people on the basic state pension in the end do better than working age population. It was useful for a time just to get the basic pension up to a decent level again, but that can't run forever. That bit will have to go. You're right, but it's also, you can look at all that another way, which is that NHS has been protected until very recently. School spending has been protected up to the age of 16. And you could actually say that these are kind of middle class interests as well as generational interests. People, one of the great quirks of this country is that we are immensely proud that we have a National Health Service that's available to everyone regardless of need and without charge. That's deep in the British psyche, and that is protected, and that's a cross-class interest, but it's also a middle-class interest, Decent schools remain a middle-class interest. So it's sort of it's continuing to tie the middle class into the broader bits of the welfare state, not just, by contrast, the working age benefit system has just got much more means tested, much more work requirements around it. It's a lot tougher, harder system than it was before. Pensioners have been, been overprotected since the financial crisis. I wouldn't quarrel with that at all as an analysis. And bits of that will have to go, just because there is an intergenerational issue there.
The other big area of reform, we touched on it earlier, for older people has been social care. They both have reform processes addressed to them, and yet the politics of one works and the politics of the other spectacularly fails. Yeah. What accounts for that?
Well, I think we'll never solve the social care problem until we solve a much more basic underlying... let me start again slightly. I'm not saying pensions was easy, it was anything but easy, but it's a highly quantifiable problem around which you can put parameters and come to a kind of quantitative as well as a qualitative solution. The problem with social care is there is absolutely no agreement in this country, and this cuts across political parties in all ways, about why do you have money in old age. If you need social care, are your savings there to hand on to your kids, or are they there to look after you in your old age, and should be required to spend it down to a basic Beveridgean level of where the state does intervene? Or do you have the right to leave your money to your kids? And whilst we are extremely proud of the fact that the NHS is available to all and free at the point of use, and we see this as a national icon, we just don't have the same attitude to social care. There is no agreement about whether, there are people who would like social care to operate like the NHS, but there are other people who say, no, your money in old age is there to look after you, you should use that. And we do not have any consensus around that. So it's just nightmarish politics. And it's nightmarish because it actually cuts across parties. It would be true that Labour, Labour in bulk would be more towards, we need something like Andy Burnham proposed a National Health and Social Care Service, but even that wasn't fully paid for. And it would be true the Conservatives say that your job is to, but on the other hand, the Conservatives are the party of inheritance, and a lot of them believe you should be able to hand the money down to your kids, and there are plenty of people in the Labour Party who have a similar sort of view. So it's just difficult. And I don't think we'll ever get to a tolerably sensible solution until we find some way of having that debate and coming to an agreement about it, a consensus about it. And there have been plenty of attempts to do it, but none of them have gained traction. Dunlop was a neat bit of reform to one part of the system. It didn't address the whole thing. It wasn't asked to address the whole thing. It was one part of the solution. And it sort of tried to reach any consensus. More generous means test at the bottom end, cap for those at the top, legislative for. That did become a victim of the financial crisis.
Yeah.
Osborne canned it because the deficit was coming down more slowly. It was going to cost more money. So he postponed. This is technically still postponed, but it's not going to happen. It's in local government. Local government would not want to give it up. I mean, if you get beyond that, it's just a cultural difference. I mean, people who do social care and people who are in healthcare think differently. It's partly why. So the transfer between the two is they just view the world differently. You know, so the people in local government say we don't want a medical model of care in old age. You know, health people will be saying, well, you need some more medical services in there to keep people out of my hospital. You know, I mean, it's, you know, there's just cultural difference because the two are run separately. The means test, you know, the one is free at the point of use, the other is means tested. It's just a nightmare. I mean, it's a genuinely difficult issue.
So just finally then, so just standing back and looking at the Turner Commission and looking at pensions reform over that period spanning different governments, you know, where does that rank in the kind of long run of the welfare state in the UK?
Yeah, well, it depends partly on, you know, what, you know, your political view of what the welfare state should be. If you're in favour of a really large welfare state, then clearly the state system is much less generous than it used to be. In the heyday of SERPs and all that, it's meaner. But you can look at it another way round and say that given where we had got to, this is no mean achievement. I mean, we now have a basic state pension on which you can be pretty damn sure if you save on top, you will see the benefit of that, even if you're not saving a lot. You have a vehicle that helps you do that if you want it. And that's very Beveridgean and sensible, and in the face of an ageing and growing population, we need to raise state pension age, we need to do these things. It's a pretty good, you know, I'd say it's one of the big hits of public policy in the last 20 or 30 years, given where we got to.